After months of watching its neighbor Finland enter NATO first, Sweden recently overcame the final hurdles of Turkey and Hungary on its way into the military alliance, officially putting an end to the tradition. Its military non-alignment. By joining NATO, Sweden completes a 30-year process of changing from the grand strategy that existed since the Napoleonic era of not joining the alliance to avoid war, to the grand strategy of joining a strong alliance to avoid war. Mr. Robert Dahlsjö, research director of the Swedish Defence Research Agency, told Dan Tri reporter. Along with Finland's accession, Sweden's membership will help NATO change the European security architecture and strengthen what it often calls deterrence against Russia, according to experts. On the contrary, Moscow will also perceive these developments as a threat. Ever since Sweden and Finland both submitted applications to join NATO, Russia has warned that there will be corresponding technical military response measures. Eliminate uncertainty. Before joining NATO, Sweden has had a close relationship with this military alliance for the past 30 years. Sweden has contributed to a number of alliance missions and also cooperates closely with the vast majority of NATO allies in Europe as part of its EU membership. But until recently, Sweden was not an official NATO member. This reality more or less raises the question of whether, when conflicts break out between NATO and Russia in the Baltic region or Finland, Sweden will lend this alliance a route to move troops or not. Sweden's accession to NATO removes the element of uncertainty in how Stockholm will act when a crisis or conflict occurs, Mr. Dahlsjö said. Geographic location is perhaps the biggest advantage that Sweden brings to NATO, helping this alliance have a logistics hub. Looking at the map, we can see that Sweden is an essential piece in the NATO picture, creating strategic depth for Finland and the Baltic countries, Mr. Dahlsjö said. Alliance policymakers have long worried about how to support the Baltic countries if Russia seizes the nearly 70 kilometers long corridor called Suwalki Gap connecting Belarus and Russia's Kaliningrad. Sweden's location bordering both the North Sea and the Baltic Sea will make it easier for NATO to move reinforcements. With Sweden's membership, the Baltic Sea has become what some analysts call a NATO lake, making it easier for the alliance to monitor Russian nuclear submarines entering and leaving the high seas. Sweden has a high-tech defense industry that can build its own fighter jets, corvettes, and naval submarines that specialize in operating in the challenging environment of the Baltic Sea. Sweden's self-defense capabilities in the Baltic Sea are quite developed, Ms. Gunilla Heralf, senior researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Relations, told Dan Tri reporter. In addition, Sweden also has the ability to fight and defend itself in the Arctic territory, that is, northern Sweden. This is also something that many countries do not have, Ms. Heralf added. From separate thinking to collective thinking. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Stockholm believed that war was a thing of the past. Within 20 years, the country reduced the size of its army by about 90% and its navy and air force by about 70%, according to a 2011 report by author Hella Odin for the Swedish Ministry of Finance. But after Russia deployed troops in Georgia in 2008 and annexed Crimea in 2014, Sweden suddenly realized it had a deterrence deficit, as Mr. Dahlsjö called it. The war in Ukraine has really conveyed the message that hoping for the best is not a good strategy. Russia's statements regarding nuclear war also show that conventional forces are not enough of a deterrent. Mr. Dahlsjö said. Joining NATO, Sweden enjoys security guarantees from Article 5 on collective defense, but must also fulfill membership obligations, including ensuring defense spending. AFP cited data from the Swedish government as reporting that the country's defense spending in 1990 was 2.6% of GDP, but the number dropped to 1.2% in 2020. But the defense budget the price increased again after Russia announced its annexation of Crimea in 2014. In March 2022, Sweden announced it would increase defense spending again to reach its target of 2% of GDP as soon as possible. Towards the end of last year, the Swedish government said military spending would exceed the 2% target by 2024, the standard threshold for NATO countries. Rearming Sweden will be a big, financial, burden. This receives great support but still puts pressure on society, Ms. Heralf said. Entering NATO, Sweden will have to change its defense policy thinking. Instead of focusing exclusively on territorial defense, Stockholm will have to think from an alliance perspective to adapt to the new context. Sweden is now switching to collective defense, which means we will defend Sweden right from Finland and the Baltic countries. That is a huge change in both thinking and actual capabilities, because this requires an army capable of deploying to neighboring countries, Mr. Dalsjo said. However, Ms. Haralf said that Stockholm will not change diplomatically because the foreign policy of NATO countries has always been quite independent. Sweden is unlikely to agree to place U.S. nuclear weapons on its territory. Russia will respond in the long run. The Kremlin has always believed that NATO expansion is a direct threat to Russia's security. President Vladimir Putin also stated that this was one of the reasons why he launched a special military campaign in Ukraine. Maria Zakharova, spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, recently said that Sweden's move to join NATO is increasing tensions and militarization. We will closely monitor Sweden's actions in the aggressive military bloc, how the country realizes its membership in practice, Reuters on February 28 quoted Ms. Zakharova as saying. Based on this, we will respond with retaliatory steps of a technical, military and other nature. It is unclear what the technical military measures that the Russian side often mentions will include. Recently, Swedish officials have warned of the risk from hybrid attacks, including cybercrime. Meanwhile, Finland says that a series of recent incidents involving refugees crossing into the country from Russia is an example of Moscow's mixed operations, according to Bloomberg. According to two authors Nicholas Locker and Heli Hautala, right now, Russia has had a number of reactions. The reform plan for 2023 to 2026 will include the creation of an army group in the Republic of Karelia near the border with Finland, as well as the re-establishment of the Moscow and Leningrad military districts through the dissolution of the Western Military District present, the authors wrote on War on the Rocks. In the immediate future, Moscow will still face limitations in its ability to respond militarily because it is still focused on the war in Ukraine. But in the end, Russia will regroup and may make a permanent adjustment in its posture in response to NATO's presence in Finland and Sweden. As Russia gradually moves away from the war in Ukraine, NATO's moves to build new infrastructure will further increase Moscow's threat assessment and cause it to pay more attention to its western flank. North, wrote authors Locker and Hautala.